me which is the more stable of the two, okay? Let's use this as shape 1, okay? Now I'm going to show you shape 2, and then I want you to tell me which is more stable, shape 1 or shape 2? Shape 2. And the reason why? Because the two negative charges repel each other. They want to get as far away from each other as they can. So does this make sense that this is a stable shape for this protein? Okay, cool. Now, I have this protein in your body, and I said that this was negative at the end. And this is an environmental signal, and I'm going to talk about environmental signals. Signals are either other molecules or atoms or energy. Energy can be signals as well. But in this case, let's say it's a molecule. Let's say it's estrogen, a hormone. And let's just say that it's very positively charged. What's the charge on here? Negative. A negative? Okay, so if this is coming along and this is positive, what happens when two opposite charges come near each other? So all of a sudden you're going to find that there's a binding. This is where the estrogen binds to the protein. Now this is more positive than this negative. So the question is this. What's the charge at this end of the molecule now? Positive. What's the charge at this one? Now the question is very simple. Is this shape of the molecule stable or is this one more stable? This is so fundamental. I want you to understand how critical this is. You understood that there was a shape, that if I have this molecule on, let's say I take this molecule off, what's the shape going to do? It's going to open back up like this, right? And then if I put the molecule back on, what's the shape going to do? Close. Well, you just told me there were two shapes that were stable, and the difference is when I add this signal, I go from one shape to the other. Does that make sense? Well, that is where life comes from. Life is movement of the proteins. The proteins move, and when they change shape, they can do jobs. So if I have work, I can have this thing do a job. By opening and closing, that would be its job. So you can say, well, what kind of jobs are just like simple movements? I'll give you a simple one. Let's say I'm a protein, and that this is the signal molecule, and I stand like this, and when the signal molecule hits in my hand, I go like that, and I let go of the signal. What happens if I let go of the signal? What's going to happen? I'm going to go back. And then another signal comes in my hand. Then what am I going to do? Go like this. And you say, well, that's a nice simple movement, but what does that have to do with it? Well, if your house is on fire, and you have a bucket brigade, and I'm a protein in the middle, and somebody hands me the bucket, what am I going to do? Pick it from here and pass it to the other guy. Well, the point about it is very simply this. Proteins provide for my physical structure, but proteins can change shape when a signal binds to that protein. So all of a sudden it says that a static protein could just be sitting here, but the moment the signal shows up, the protein does something. Well, that something is hooked or actually used to do a job in the cell. So what is digestion? Here's an enzyme. It stands here. Here's the food molecule, and it gets caught in my hand, and I bring it together, and I rip it apart. That's all it is. Ripping apart. Digestion. So the bottom line is this. You're a machine. The structure of the machine is due to the protein parts. The proteins are all these linear chains made out of amino acids. That the final structure is due to the sequence of the amino acids and the charge. That's this critical part. When I balance the charge, the protein is stable. If I change the charge, the protein changes its shape. It's simple, but it's very basic science, okay? And here's the point about it is this, is that and this is interesting because this is right out of the Science Journal, and this is backbone here, this protein in green, is the same one that's in yellow. And in this case, this is a protein that causes muscle contraction in your body. And it depends on this signal. The signal is calcium. When calcium shows up, it plugs into the hole. It changes the charge, and it causes the protein to change its shape from this inactive form, conformation 1, shape 1. When I add the signal, it goes to shape 2, the active form. If I take the signal away, then the protein goes back to the resting state. So there are two different shapes to the protein, an active and an inactive form, and the activity is now controlled by the signal. So basically it says that proteins provide for your physical structure, but proteins also provide for your behavior. Your behavior is the movement, the actions that you express in your life. And the movement comes from the movement of protein. So basically it says this, your behavior represents the action of a protein that interacts with a signal. And so that the signal activates the protein to move, and the movement generates behavior. Well, why this is important then, it says this. If I have just the protein and no signal, what happens? Nothing. So then action is really by what? Controlling the signal. So here's the point. The brain of the cell is the structure that controls the signals to tell the cell what to do in response to the environment. So we want to understand the brain of the cell because there's a very limited time. And over the weekend, when I have 12 hours or so to talk about it, I can expand on it. But in a very brief moment, the brain of the cell is the skin of the cell, the membrane. It's the same as your skin. And you might say to yourself, what do you mean, the skin and the brain, they look like two different things? And the answer is this. In embryology, there are germ layers, or 3 germ layers that create the ultimate full-size organism. The germ layers are called ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. They're layers of cells. Each layer gives rise to different organs and tissues. Interesting? The outer layer, called the ectoderm, only gives rise to 2 things in the human body. Skin and the brain and nervous system. Your brain is derived from your skin. And it makes sense as to why, because I'll show you, the skin is the interface between the environment and the cytoplasm. The skin can read what's going on and then tell the proteins in the cell what to do. I told you I could take the nucleus out of the cell and didn't change the behavior. And the reason why is the nucleus is not the brain of the cell. The nucleus is the gonad of the cell. It's reproduction. If I need a part to make the cell work, then the nucleus is like the Butterick pattern drawer. It's got all the patterns to make 70,000 different parts in your body, but the nucleus doesn't know which one is needed at which time. The nucleus has no intelligence. The nucleus is just the repository for the pattern. So if I take the nucleus out of the cell, I didn't change anything about the cell. The cell will die after a while for the following reason. The proteins that make up the machinery break down and wear out. And if they break down, I got to replace them, otherwise I die. So I need the nucleus not for the intelligence, I only need the nucleus for the blueprint. So there's no brain involved with genes. Genes are not capable of that. How does the cell membrane work? It takes an environmental signal, and it could be anything. It could be sunshine. It could be hot air. It could be sound. It could be anything that's out there, chemicals, smells, taste, anything that's from the environment. The membrane picks that up, and the environmental signal is called the primary signal. And then what happens then is this. The membrane converts the environmental signal into the signal that controls the protein, so that the behavior is mediated by the cell membrane as it responds to the environment. The behavior, if I cut off the environment, the cell has no behavior. Your cell with all the components in it, if I could cut off the environment from the cell, it will just sit there. It has no life. Life is due to how the cell responds to the environment. Your life is how you respond to your environment. As you see the environment, as you walk out of here, those are environmental signals. They actually run your proteins and make you behave. So your behavior is not due to the genes. We didn't even bring DNA in yet. Your behavior is due to how you see the signal, which is called perception, and then convert that signal into selecting the right proteins for your responses. Okay? So now the issue is, how does this membrane work? Well, that's the beautiful part. It's relatively simple. Let me explain it. If we look at some cells growing on a petri dish, and we look at the skin of the cells, it's all bubbly looking, but at a higher magnification, this is what it looks like. At higher magnification, the skin is like a sandwich. It looks like a bread and butter sandwich, and there's this lipid layer right in the middle, and it's the oil that makes the skin a barrier, because the water in the environment can't go through the membrane, and the water inside the cell can't go through the membrane. So under the skin, there's a protected environment of which all the mechanisms can work. To show you the reality of it, this is an electron microscope picture of the actual cell membrane. You see the dark light, dark layer of the cell membrane? It really represents the layer of these molecules that look like this, okay? Dark, light, dark, so that the model and the image of the real picture are very much exactly the same thing. But this membrane isn't functional because I left out the most important part of the membrane. It's the proteins that we were talking about that are capable of responding to the signal and then